Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Brian Lee Crowley, Managing Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'd like to welcome you to this special event on maritime security issues in that crucible of the world's future, the Indo-Pacific. Thank you for being with us. Before handing off to my inestimable colleague, Jonathan Berkshire Miller, who will moderate today's discussion, I wanted to announce with great pleasure that this event kicks off the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Canada and the Indo-Pacific Initiative, a project that will be led by Jonathan and the rest of the team here at MLI. The initiative will focus on a range of critical areas in the Indo-Pacific, from security to trade to governance. This region is of crucial importance to Canada and must not be overlooked. Today's discussion will focus on just one element of these stakes. The Indo-Pacific is facing a host of shared security challenges, from maritime piracy and crime to heated territorial disputes. To shed light on these issues, we're pleased, once again, to bring together some of the leading thinkers from Canada and the world to discuss the key maritime challenges in the Indo-Pacific and how Canada can and should become an indispensable partner alongside like-minded allies in ensuring a free and open Pacific Ocean in our interests and those of all humanity. We do these events with you in mind, so I thank you again for your interest in MLI's work, and now pass the baton to Jonathan Berkshire Miller, the host of today's event. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Brian, for that kind introduction. Good morning, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jonathan Berkshire Miller, and I am Director and Senior Fellow of the Indo-Pacific Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute based here in Ottawa. It is my great pleasure today to be your moderator for what I'm sure will be a dynamic and very timely discussion on the shared maritime security challenges in this region. We are really lucky to have speakers today coming to us live from Tokyo, Washington, D.C., Paris, and Nova Scotia, which is very close to my heart as a maritimer. First of all, I'd like to thank all of our supporters, audience members, and others today for joining this discussion. As Brian noted, today is important not only because we are talking about these crucial maritime security issues, but also because today is the launch of MLI's Canada and the Indo-Pacific Initiative, which will commit a great deal of our efforts and resources in the coming months to looking at this pivotal region and how it intersects with Canada. We hope you continue to join our future events on the Indo-Pacific and read our future essays and policy briefs on Canada's strategic imperative to understand and organize its engagement in this region. Rather than marginalize the geopolitical risks in the region, the COVID-19 pandemic has conversely heightened geostrategic competition with a rise in tensions, which is perhaps most acute in the Indo-Pacific. Some examples include renewed tensions in the East and South China Seas, skirmishes on the India-China line of actual control, an uptick of provocations and rhetoric from North Korea, bolder Chinese activities in the Taiwan Straits, and a rapidly evolving situation in Hong Kong. All of these geopolitical shifts are happening within the broader strategic lens of a hardening of competition between the United States and China. These concerns in the maritime realm are also not limited to the East and South China Seas. In the Indian Ocean, there has been a buildup of Chinese infrastructure development in critical areas, such as deep ports in Sri Lanka and Pakistan. These moves have acutely informed the decision-making of policymakers in India, who are aware of China's long-term geopolitical motivations in Delhi's periphery. Similarly, in the Pacific Ocean, there is also concern that encroachment and strategic competition is jeopardizing the future of sovereignty of many small island nations. Finally, it is important to note that these maritime challenges are not limited only to issues of territory and military competition, but also encompass critical issues such as environmental security, maritime piracy, and the sustainability of fish stocks in the surrounding seas. Simply put, this is a multifaceted series of challenges with no simple solution. So with that said, let me briefly introduce today's participants. First of all, we have Professor Ken Jimbo, who I'm introducing him first, and he'll go first because he's calling from the latest time zone. He's near midnight. Professor Ken Jimbo is a professor at the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University, and he also holds a number of other titles, including a senior research fellow at the Cannon Institute of Global Studies and the Tokyo Foundation. After Ken, we're going to have Greg Poling from Washington, D.C., and for those of you who were able to attend our event last year in Ottawa before the pandemic, Greg was able to be there in Ottawa, and I made a joke, and it's a joke, but it's real. If you do a Google image search of Greg in the South China Sea, you'll see his face come every time. So he's an expert on the South China Sea. He's a senior fellow for Southeast Asia and director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at CSIS. And I believe that Greg has just completed or is finishing his book on the South China Sea. So maybe at some point, Greg, you can tell us about that. After Greg, we have Eva Pesova, who is a senior Japan fellow at the Vrije University in Brussels. Also, she's an associate fellow at the FRS in France and a senior advisor of the Asia-Pacific Research and Advice Network. And Eva is an expert on maritime security issues and formerly worked with the European External Action Service. And last, but definitely not least, we have Eric Leary, who served in the Royal Canadian Navy for 36 years, with his last post as commander of the Canadian Fleet Pacific. In that role, he was the Coalition Task Group commander for the South. He also held a role, where he was the Coalition Task Group commander for the Southern Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz sector during the War on Terror. After retiring from the Royal Canadian Navy, Commander Leary has also received his PhD from Dalhousie and now is an independent scholar and has many good policy briefs, some of them at MLI. So we have a great cast here from all over the world to talk on these issues. Let's get started with Ken, if you don't mind, because you're the farthest away. So Ken, I'll give it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for your kind introduction. And I'm very pleased to join this webinar. And a warm congratulations, Jonathan, for launching the MLI Indo-Pacific initiative. I would like to make 3 points regarding Indo-Pacific. First, the Indo-Pacific remains to be the leading foreign policy concept, despite having a major leadership transitions, both in Tokyo and Washington, D.C. And for Tokyo, the concept has been reaffirmed in numerous occasions, as the words of Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga, and through the numbers of the meetings with the foreign leaders. For Washington, D.C., there seems to be certain degrees of hesitation among the Biden transition team whether to carry over the concept from the previous administration. But many of U.S. commitments so far, and also through the Congress initiatives and renaming of, for example, PACOM to the Indo-PACOM, already implemented under the Indo-Pacific concept. And it has also become the dominant regional policy platform for major European states, including UK, France, and Germany, and also for ASEAN. So that the concept has created so-called diplomatic gravity that many players will plug and play on this platform. And I believe that the gravity remains to be strong. That's my first point. And the second, something we should also emphasize is that different priorities and approaches do exist in Indo-Pacific concept. And I always argue that the Indo-Pacific concept would only be successful if everybody in the town claims the copyright of this concept, which means that there should be no one-fits-all type of understanding for the Indo-Pacific. For example, for the case of Tokyo, there are certain degrees of mixture of so-called competitive approaches to this concept, and also the cooperative side of the approaches by utilizing this Indo-Pacific. And for the case of emphasizing the role of the U.S. forward presence and emphasizing freedom navigation and overflights, advancing so-called Quad security cooperation, And that also extends to the economic domain. For example, the regional investment for the quality infrastructure and the promoting the Blue Dot network or the China Free Clean Digital Network are all regarded to be pursuing the competitive approach under the Indo-Pacific. However, there are numerous elements of the non-zero-sum side of the cooperative approaches involved in this concept. So that includes exploring interface between Indo-Pacific and the China-led Belt and Road Initiative through, for example, co-financing in infrastructure projects and also bilateral schemes to be found like in Japan-China cooperation in the third market. And also, recently, we found the significance of the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, that also be found by having the Japan, China, Korea, first time in the history joining in the FTA network together. So by knowing such cooperative approaches, Beijing was able to take more nuanced approach, especially in contrast with what the Moscow is approaching to this Indo-Pacific. And then they are not fully accepting the concept, but neither totally deny it. And I think this is a very important interface by how to recast the strategy in this wider regional framework. And finally, with a quick notes that I also like to mention that impact of the COVID-19. And I would say that despite the spread of COVID-19, the security challenge in the Indo-Pacific have been constantly updated. With having, as Jonathan mentioned, that having a Chinese, sort of modus operandi, maritime activities, both in East and South China Sea and beyond. And correspondingly, we resumed joint training and exercises among U.S. and partners, especially the latter half of this year, by having biannual Operation Keen Sword, joint exercises between Japan and the United States off the coast of Okinawa, and also iconic Quad Malabar naval exercise in the Bay of Bengal, and also so-called the Pacific Vanguard exercise in Guam by US, Japan, Australia, and Korea. And so I think those kind of defense cooperation network has been quite viable despite the COVID-19 spread. So I would like to end my remark by saying that the pandemic has accelerated the change of the geopolitics that has already begun before the pandemic broke out. And I believe that it continues to be the trend for 2021 in the role of the Indo-Pacific. I'll stop here and looking forward to the further discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much, Ken. That's really helpful comments, and so much to kind of tease out there. I really liked your point that when looking at the Indo-Pacific, we don't need to have this one box fits all. The Indo-Pacific concept can, and I think has shown in recent months that there are many ways to kind of for states to fit into this concept, and they all don't necessarily need to follow to the T the U.S. approach or the Japanese approach or others, but they can take parts of that. So that's a really interesting point. Okay, can I move next to Greg Poling, please, Greg?
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to talk, pick up where Ken left off and talk a bit about how things have shifted over the last 9 to 12 months amid COVID on the maritime space, and then look forward a bit to the incoming U.S. administration. So, as Ken noted, we, despite, I think, a lot of high hopes in the spring, one thing we definitely have not seen from COVID is any decrease in maritime tensions or decrease in operational tempo by any side, but particularly on China's side. So my initiative, AMTI, just published a report last week on China Coast Guard patrols. Not only did they not decrease in the South China Sea, they've actually increased the number of ship days spent patrolling reefs off the coast of the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. We expect to publish a report in the next week or two, well, hopefully next week before the holidays get us, on naval operational tempo. That'll show much the same, that there's certainly been no decrease in the number of naval exercises and naval transits conducted by either China or the United States. On the U.S. side, it seems that there was a real effort after the Roosevelt aircraft carrier was stricken with COVID to then step up operations in the region to show that the U.S. Navy's readiness hadn't been affected. And so that line's probably flat. China's might have moderately increased this year. What has certainly changed, though, is the messaging. So even if the operational tempo from China is either flat or modestly increasing, the bombastic nature of the way that this has been discussed by Chinese officials has ratcheted up radically. So one of the effects of the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, and I know that people are tired of hearing that language, but one of the effects is clearly that when incidents have cropped up over the last 9 months, the oil and gas disputes with Malaysia, both in the spring and the fall, the two different boat rammings vis-a-vis Vietnam, targeting of the Filipinos with fire control radar in the spring, right? All of this happens. And rather than seek to de-escalate, as would have been normal, as for instance China did when there was a fishing standoff with Indonesia at the very beginning of the year, Chinese diplomats, even those in the embassies in those countries, have basically gone in front of the camera and said, tough, these are our waters and we'll do what we want. It's a level of rhetoric that we really haven't seen since the kind of highest days of tension shortly after the Filipinos filed their arbitration case back in 2013, 2014. And it certainly clashes with the tone that Beijing has taken since 2016, where for the last 3 to 4 years, there was an effort to quietly tamp down tensions diplomatically, even while pursuing more operational presence on the water. I think that that's going to continue. We don't see any evidence that Beijing is shifting toward a more, diplomatic, soft approach toward its neighbors. And at the same time, we've seen pretty sharp shifts among other Indo-Pacific players that I think will continue to play out. So Australia is the obvious case. Right now, the discussion about China in Australia has radically shifted. For the last several years, it was often the case that Americans would say, well, the Australians are about 2 years behind us on the China threat. And whether it's the South China Sea or the East China Sea or trade issues, that's no longer the case. I think it's now pretty clear that the bulk of discussion within Australia is now right where or ahead of where the U.S. is vis-a-vis China. China has also continued to increase presence around the Senkakus in the East China Sea. The overall number of patrols hasn't changed, but the length of stay of these Chinese vessels has increased. They've hit new records almost every month this year. And so that has helped lead to a breakdown with Tokyo. Obviously, the COVID-19 caused Xi's visit to Tokyo to be canceled. But even without that, tensions have clearly increased, and I expect that to continue. We've seen, as we're going to hear in a moment, a number of European parties weigh in more explicitly on these questions, including the South China Sea, in ways that we haven't seen since at least early 2016. And so I think there is a sense that on both China and the kind of the Indo-Pacific partner side, and that's not even mentioning India, of course, which after Ladakh is clearly ahead of the rest of us on its sense of the China threat, that everybody is poised to increase, not decrease, maritime tensions. And so that leads to what do we expect from the U.S. side? Well, there's been a bit of heartburn in Asia, but mainly from just a small number of Asian countries, Vietnam, India, some quarters in Japan, that the Biden team might be too soft on China. But the vast majority of the region, when you look at the public opinion polling, seems to feel pretty good. Most of them reported, both public and elite polling, that they preferred a Biden administration to a second Trump administration. They've gotten what they wanted. Now the Biden team will have to deliver. But the reason that they preferred that is because I think most in Asia recognize that the entire U.S. conversation has shifted. So there is no world in which Biden can be soft on China, right? This will not look like the incoming Obama team in 2009. There are no doves, China doves left in the Democratic caucus in the United States. Most of them had already shifted over the last few years based on the trade issues, the high-tech issues, South China Sea and Xinjiang. I think Hong Kong was the final nail in the coffin. Any Democrat who might have still been holding out hope for a return to more calm bilateral tensions, that went away with the national security law in the spring. And so Biden comes in a different world than Obama did, and a different world than Trump did. He also comes in with a cabinet that's lining up to be the most qualified and most familiar with Asia that we've had in decades, at least. And so I think they will be much more likely to hit the ground running with things like the U.S.-Japan alliance, getting the U.S.-Philippine alliance back on track, recognizing that the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the rising tensions on cross-strait relations, that those are immediate challenges. And finally, I think the reason that the Biden administration likely has more credibility on some of these issues is that the first thing they're going to do on day one is issue an executive order rejoining Paris, re-engaging with the WHO, and joining the COVAX alliance. Those two things, re-engagement with climate change and re-engagement with global health policy, are going to give them considerably more credibility than the current team. And when a Biden team goes out to Asia and talks about international law and freedom of the seas, I think that they're going to have a lot more credibility than the Trump team, right? When Mike Pompeo comes in and says, hey, let's talk about freedom of the seas, everybody goes, okay, we get that you don't like China, but come on, you're gonna talk to us about international law. So I don't, there's no guarantee that things are going to be more rational or more strategic or improve, but I would say that this incoming team has a much better shot at it than the departing one. And I'll wrap up there.
Well, thanks so much, Greg. Again, a lot to tease out of that. You know, I would agree with you. I mean, a couple different interesting points that you made. One on U.S.-China strategic competition. I would agree that it's structural in its nature. I think you referenced the bipartisan consensus on this, and this is something that if people think this is going to go away in 2 months, I think that they're mistaken. Another important point that I think you alluded to, which I hear from some of my friends in Asia as well, is that the subsecretary sort of positions, which many of them haven't been filled in the U.S. during the Trump administration. Sometimes it's like having that friend where he's not picking up the phone because he's not there. That really matters. I mean, it seems sort of boring and in the weeds, but I think the way that diplomacy works often is at that subsecretary level, and not having those positions really, I think, was a detriment. So hopefully those positions can get filled under a new U.S. administration. And also, I mean, maybe something we can kind of look at question time is the future of, at least from a branding perspective, the free and open Indo-Pacific from the U.S. I think there's a lot of sort of speculation on that too. Secure and prosper seems to be the new moniker used often. I mean, whether that qualitatively means anything differently, probably not, but maybe it's a new acronym for us to learn. But very interesting remarks. And I think it's a good segue to Eva, because I think one of your really important points was that while these challenges are definitely there in the U.S.-China relationship and it's impacted the U.S. approach to the Indo-Pacific, by no means is that unique. And I think that's a really crucial point. I think from our perch here sitting in Canada, we see that quite clearly. Obviously, we're watching U.S.-China competition, but we have our own unique challenges with China. Australia has its own unique challenges with China. And I'm sure Eva will let us know soon that many countries in Europe are facing the same balancing act. So Eva, over to you, please.
Thanks, Jonathan, and congratulations also from me on your new position. I'm delighted that Canada is getting so active in the Indo-Pacific debate, and that's something that really it has in common with Europe and some of the other partners that were a little bit late in joining the debate or starting the reflection. And in that sense, as you said, I would follow up rather naturally on what Greg said, because Europe is one of those late awakers to the China challenge, although it has been a trend that lasts now since 2016, roughly. But we are kind of on the verge of formulating our own Indo-Pacific strategy. But for the longest time, of course, Europe has been reluctant to join it for the same reason, I think, that Canada and other kind of middle actors, I call them stuck in the middle actors, not necessarily middle powers, for the fear of being kind of drawn into one or the other camp, between the US and China rivalry, having obvious interests, economic interests with China. Now, even if the Europeans have been kind of not very vocal on the Indo-Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, that doesn't mean that they haven't been concerned. Of course, as the world's largest trading bloc, the maritime security, especially in the region, and the need to maintain free, safe, and secure maritime environment has been a top priority for the EU's foreign policy. And in fact, maritime security has been the key pillar in engaging with some of the Asian partners, whether it was Japan, Korea, ASEAN, India, and Australia, of course, US on the other hand. Maritime security is also an area where Europeans have been most involved. Now, I thought Greg and Ken will be talking extensively about the South China Sea and the East China Sea disputes, which are some of the most visible security hotspots. And even there, Greg mentioned, yes, we tried as much as we could eventually to be present with the French routine exercises since 2016, with, of course, also a symbolic political presence of other European member states, with the UK naval presence starting in 2018, and with other kind of support at the European level, albeit not through gunboats or naval presence, but let's say by the deposition of note verbale at the UN Security Council by the UK, Germany, and France in September. I mean, this is the sort of different levels where the EU can join. But besides the more traditional security hotspots, South China Sea, East China Sea, it seems that it's never enough repeated. It really is not the only security issues in the region. When it comes to maritime security, we mentioned piracy, we mentioned crime, climate change, environmental issues, all sorts of practical functional security issues that really needs to be addressed. And that is that sort of front that EU has been working extensively for the last couple of years in promoting maritime domain awareness, in promoting, let's say, rules-based solution, in promoting environmental solutions, maritime multilateralism with ASEAN, maritime connectivity. There's a separate faction in the connectivity strategy looking at maritime security, promoting port security, port safety, etc., etc. So these are not obviously less visible, but not irrelevant issues that really needs to be addressed in the Indo-Pacific, and that seem to be completely overweight and kind of ignored in the mounting US-China rivalry and in the focus, extreme focus on hard security issues. Now, although there is no Indo-Pacific strategy for now, as we speak, there is one in the making. You know that different member states have their own Indo-Pacific strategies, and the key issues that I mentioned, maritime multilateralism, promotion of international law, connectivity, maritime domain awareness, are something that are issues that are repeated in all security strategies or Indo-Pacific strategies that currently exist. France has been the first one. Of course, France is a resident Indo-Pacific power. It has maritime territories. It is the largest EEZ in the region. It has a naval presence and has a strategy, Indo-Pacific strategy, since 2017. A big surprise was the decision by Germany to publish its Indo-Pacific policy guidelines at the beginning of September. And that really started this kind of renewed interest at the EU level to eventually come up with an EU guidelines, followed by the Netherlands in November, just a month ago. I think now we have a non-paper that is currently circulated at the COASI group, which is the consultancy, the group of member states at the European Council in charge of Asia-Pacific affairs. So we are likely to see a document, whether it's called strategy, vision, or guidelines, probably at the beginning of 2021. We can speculate about the content. I'm glad that everyone mentioned before me that Indo-Pacific is a flexible concept that suits actually the European interests very well. We can assume that the core principles of maritime, when it comes to maritime security at least, maritime multilateralism, transparent connectivity or maritime connectivity, and of course, freedom of navigation and rules-based solutions will be at the core. And that is probably, hopefully, something that we will be able to work on with other partners, including Canada and those who have been reluctant for the longest time to actually join the debate for the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning.
Thank you so much, Eva. I think that's really helpful remarks, and I think it underscores the point that Ken made at the beginning that that Indo-Pacific concepts need not be kind of uniform, but they can suit different partners. And I know the Canadians very much will be interested to see as more European states kind of develop their concepts. I remember, I think it was a couple years back now. Time seems to have flown so quickly since the pandemic started. But when I was at the Shangri-La Dialogue and I came back with one of the glossy pamphlets that the French Defense Ministry has on their Indo-Pacific approach. And I remember the sort of the jaws dropping in Canada and from some of the bureaucracy folks who looked at it. And it takes me to an important point, and I think that perhaps some states in Europe have kind of done a better job at this, is the public diplomacy side of the Indo-Pacific. So of course, the nuts and bolts of what you're actually going to do is very, very important, and it has to align with your interests. But I think the branding and public diplomacy is really important to signal to states in that region that this is a theater of great importance. So I think perhaps that's something, again, the Canadian side can learn from different member countries in Europe. With that, I'm going to pass next to Commodore Laurier for a very important perspective from Canada. And Commodore Laurier has spent so much time in the Canadian Navy, so I'm sure he has some great insights on this. So Commodore Laurier.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for some great presentations. I'm going to focus on the areas of greatest security concern to Canada and those where we are directly involved. They occasionally are not the same. North Korea. Despite UN sanctions, the North Korean regime continues to develop and test long-range missiles and enrich uranium for its nuclear weapons programs. China, regrettably, is assisting North Korea via surreptitious efforts to export its products. Canada continues to support the sanction enforcement effort by regularly sending a frigate and a maritime patrol aircraft, and all of this is well coordinated via the 7th Fleet staffs. While this effort has not stopped weapons development, it has provided the necessary function of demonstrating that rule breaking will bring consequences. It also illustrates the value of a multinational approach, especially for Canada. Hong Kong. China has broken its 1997 agreement to provide a one country, two systems approach to Hong Kong. Canada, in company with its Five Eyes allies, has condemned this move, cancelled its extradition treaty with Hong Kong, and begun an export ban on sensitive goods to it. We also appear to have particularly upset China after Parliament considered extending asylum to Hong Kong's democracy protesters. This led the Chinese ambassador in Canada to suggest such action could affect the safety of Canada's 300,000 citizens in the territory. When questioned by the media, he did not deny that this was a threat. If conditions seriously deteriorate in Hong Kong, it will present a non-combatant extraction operation of potentially immense difficulty, as China is very likely to interfere. This will cause for a major maritime multinational response, and there is no framework for this now. Taiwan. China continues to threaten Taiwan with almost daily aircraft probing its defenses. It has also in China created an exact replica of downtown Taipei to assist Chinese airborne forces in practicing a potential air assault. This is outrageous. Aside from supporting Taiwanese attendance at the World Health Organization, Canada has been silent. However, this year also brought the unedifying spectacle of the foreign minister refusing to say the word, quote, Taiwan, unquote, at a news conference, despite media probing for him to do so. Taiwan needs more direct diplomatic and practical support. In that light, one must commend the US and France for assisting it with defense sales, despite probably high Chinese pressure. Noting Canadian naval firms have considered doing so, but many are daunted by the challenge of getting government export approval. South China Sea. In the past earlier, Canada did not speak out over China's 9-dash line, claiming maritime rights over 80% of the South China Sea. I think many expected China to eventually reveal a legal basis for this. China did not, and the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration exposed the complete lack of any legal basis for that claim. With regard to the United Nations Convention of the Laws of the Sea, their report concluded, quote, the tribunal considers China's violation of its obligations to be manifest, period. While Canada supported the PCA decision, the tribunal decision, it only called for, quote, all states, unquote, to comply and did not even mention China. The tribunal's report, as we have heard from Greg, did not significantly affect Chinese actions in the South China Sea recently. While it's no longer building islands, the fortifications remain and are frequently used by the Chinese Coast Guard as support bases on their way to challenging other states in their own legal economic exclusive zone. Greg mentioned harassing Vietnamese, Malaysian, and Philippine oil and research activities, while they've also been terrorizing other people's fishing fleets, according to the Singapore's RSIS. This year, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel escorted Chinese fishing fleets as they penetrated Indonesia's economic exclusive zone, and this was quickly rebuffed by the Indonesian armed forces. Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam took the obvious lesson from this success and are rearming. And so does Indonesia, now seeking additional 48 fighters, 3 corvettes, and 4 submarines from France. The United States and Japan have assisted this effort, and the U.S. has recently made it crystal clear its mutual defense treaties with the Philippines and Japan will extend to their offshore islands and deployed naval forces. The U.S. has also led freedom of navigation efforts there, and this has been recently joined by Australia, Japan, UK, France, and Canada. These latter states perform a sort of freedom of navigation light, with Canada preferring the term presence patrols. We learned recently that the Canadian government has directed that these patrols be kept low profile as possible. Nevertheless, the U.S. Navy credits all those states, including Canada, for their critical support in the freedom of navigation effort. These patrols, in whatever form, signal very direct support for the rules-based international order. The setting up of a potential multilateral U.S. fleet in the area has great potential to reinforce this. In other areas, Canada has also been meeting security threats from China. Foremost here is the hostage diplomacy waged by China in response to Canada's holding Madame Meng, Chief Financial Officer of Huawei, for possible extradition to the U.S. In addition to the arrest of Michael Korbig and Spavar on dubious grounds, China has imposed a boycott of Canadian goods. There has been no Canadian response to this, other than a quiet and at times not very successful reaching out to allies for support. The government is increasingly critiqued for its timidity. One recent news report called it groveling, and a recent poll showed 75% of Canadians expect a firmer response to China. Government inaction may also be showing that hostage diplomacy works. At the same time, and in a probably related manner, China has been subject to Chinese influence operations via the successful purchase of all Canadian Chinese media, their intimidation of Chinese immigrants, and it is increasingly being alleged a program of elite capture of Canadian officials via life-changing financial payments. Both factors are likely the cause of this country's timid, unofficial China policy. The foreign minister promised a reset in January, and nothing occurred, even though the foreign policy bureaucracy provided them with a template this spring that would move away from comprehensive engagement. The major Canadian parliamentary opposition parties have used their majority to force a needed new China policy by next week. I'm not confident it will occur. All of this suggests that, and there's no surprise here, that Canada appears to be only ready to take action against China within a multilateral construct. I suspect the main effort will remain within the Five Eyes community, plus Germany and France, and not within the evolving Quad, but we'll leave that question for the discussion. We are also watching the role of the Biden administration's Summit of Democracies in all of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. That's a really helpful, a great scan of some of the different issues that we face in the region, and some that we didn't quite highlight as much. I think one thing that was really important that you noted that was the efforts of the Canadian Navy. In particular, I think you referenced Operation Neon and around the Korean Peninsula, Five Eyes Plus operation to ensure that North Korea is not able to circumvent sanctions. I think you also referenced Taiwan, Hong Kong, So it's a really comprehensive scan. And I think it highlights to my mind that it is important to note some of the positive things that Canada has been doing in this region. And I think most of those, frankly, are from the defense naval side. You highlighted a number of them. There's been a range of different port visits, whether it be to Japan and Southeast Asia, the Chikudmi-class submarine deployment. In addition to some of the nuts and bolts agreements, Canada has concluded an AXA, or a cross-servicing acquisition arrangement with Japan, and I think is on the way to developing a GSAMIA, or a military information sharing agreement. So there are some really important developments that have been happening on the defense and naval side. I think the next challenge and the next step will be to formulate this into a broader strategy, which includes the diplomatic front as well. So very impactful and important comments.